My name is Isla. I'm 37 years old, and when I woke up in the hospital bed after 5 days unconscious, the first thing I did was ask about my cat, the second was ask about my apartment, and the third was look at my older sister's face when she answered the second question and understand that something had happened that was going to change everything that came after. Carol said, "Don't worry about the apartment now, focus on recovering," and in that sentence, in the order of those words and the tone in which she said them, was all the information I needed before she said anything else. Carol used that tone when she had made a decision she knew I wouldn't have approved of and had executed it before I could object. I had been hearing it for 37 years and recognized it with the precision of someone who has learned to read a language they would prefer not to speak. I asked directly what had happened to the apartment. She told me she had spoken with the landlord, that she had cancelled the lease, that she had arranged for my things to be removed because I was going to be recovering for months and there was no point paying rent on an empty apartment. She told me this with the efficiency of someone presenting a reasonable solution, with the particular certainty of someone who has made a decision for another person and is completely convinced they did their right thing. I asked where my things were. She said she had sold the furniture because she had nowhere to store it and that she had put what fit into 3 boxes that were in her garage. I asked about the cat. She said the cat was with a neighbor who had kept him. I asked about the box of documents I kept in the bedroom closet, and her face did something that wasn't exactly guilt but closely resembled it. She said she had sold the apartment's contents as a lot to a second-hand company, that she hadn't reviewed everything in detail because she had to do it quickly before the landlord's deadline expired, that she was sorry if there was something important in that box, and that she was sure if it was important I could recover it. I lay looking at the hospital ceiling for a long moment and thought about the box, about what I knew it contained, about the documents I had stored there 10 years ago when my Aunt Rosa died and left her portion along with Carol's without Carol knowing exactly what was in that envelope because it was an envelope addressed to me with my name. And I thought, either the second-hand company has the box or Carol has it and doesn't know what's inside. And in either case I have a problem to solve before she understands what she lost. I told her I was tired and needed to sleep. Carol left convinced the conversation had ended, and I took out my phone and called my attorney. If anyone ever took everything from you while you were at your most vulnerable and the person who did it told you they had done it for your own good, subscribe to Unspoken Truth. Because this story is about what happens when the box your sister sold without checking contained exactly what she should have checked, and it is just getting started. My sister Carol is 42, 5 years older than me, and has spent her entire adult life being the person who makes decisions for others with the conviction that making decisions for others is a form of love. She doesn't do it with malice. She does it with the particular blindness of someone who confuses control with care, and who has organized her relationships around being needed in ways she doesn't always consult with the people who supposedly need her. We grew up in Portland, Oregon, daughters of parents who divorced when I was 8 and Carol was 13. Our mother raised us alone with the efficiency of a woman who had learned that the alternative to efficiency was chaos and had chosen efficiency with a determination she passed on to Carol more completely than she passed it on to me. I inherited the ability to function under pressure. Carol also inherited the certainty that functioning under pressure included functioning on behalf of their people around her even without being asked. Our relationship had always been the relationship of two people who love each other and who have sufficiently different lifestyles that close cohabitation produces friction. Carol is organized and directive and has firm opinions about how things should be done. I am more informal and more independent and have the particular resistance of someone who learned early that important decisions had to be made by herself or no one would make them, which in practice meant that Carol and I got along well at a distance, and that distance was preferable for both of us even though neither of us said so in those terms. I had lived in my apartment in the Alberta neighborhood for 6 years. It was a 2-bedroom apartment in an old building with wooden floors and large windows and a landlord named Pete, who ran the building with the affectionate informality of someone who preferred not to have problems to charging the maximum possible. The rent was reasonable for Portland at that time, which in Portland at that time meant it was a rent I protected with the awareness of someone who knows that finding another like it would require luck that wasn't guaranteed. I had a cat named Mochi, a mountain bike, furniture I had bought or found over 6 years with the aesthetic consistency of someone who doesn't decorate by system but accumulates things they like. and a life that was completely mine in the most literal sense, built by me, organized around what I wanted and not what someone else needed from me. The accident happened on a Thursday morning in October. I was cycling to work when a driver who ran a red light hit me at the intersection of Alberta and 33rd. I don't remember the impact. The last thing I remember is pedaling, and then there are 5 days that don't exist in my memory and that exist instead in the hospital records and in the faces of the people who were in that room while I wasn't present to see what they showed. The injuries were serious: fractured clavicle, 3 broken ribs, head trauma that produced the 5-day induced coma. The doctor, when he explained the full picture after I woke up, used the careful language of someone describing something that was more serious than the final result might suggest. He told me the coma had been the body's correct response, and that waking up without significant neurological sequelae was an outcome that wasn't guaranteed in the first hours. Carol had arrived at the hospital the first day. She was my emergency contact because she was my closest family member in Portland. Our mother lived in Arizona with her second husband and was the type of presence that organized itself well from a distance, but that in real emergencies produced mainly emotional phone calls rather than physical presence. Carol was the practical option, and I had put her as emergency contact with the pragmatic logic of someone who chooses the person most capable of managing a crisis, even if that management capacity sometimes overextended itself. What I hadn't anticipated was that overextending herself in a crisis included emptying my apartment. I reconstructed the complete story in the days following through conversations with Pete the landlord, with my neighbor Jenner who had kept Mochi, and with the second-hand company that had bought the apartment's contents. Carol had arrived at the hospital the first day, had seen the seriousness of the situation, and had made a series of decisions with the speed of someone who processes a crisis by converting it into a task list. The second day she had gone to my apartment with the spare key I had given her for emergencies, had assessed the situation, had called Pete on the third day to tell him I wasn't going to be able to return for months and that she was cancelling the lease with immediate effect to avoid months of unnecessary rent. Pete had told her he needed the apartment empty within 48 hours for the next tenant, and Carol had hired the second-hand company to empty the apartment on the 4th day while I was still unconscious on the floor above. The company had taken everything in the apartment in a truck and had paid Carol a sum for the contents. Carol gave me that sum when I woke up with the attitude of someone delivering the net result of a reasonable transaction. It was enough to cover 3 months' rent somewhere new. She said it with the expression of someone who believes they have solved a problem when they have actually created one. I asked about the box of documents specifically, the one I kept in the bedroom closet. Carol said she hadn't separated anything because she hadn't had time to review the contents in detail, and that if there was something important in that box I would have to contact the second-hand company to see if they still had it. I called the second-hand company from the hospital. They told me the apartment's contents had already been processed, that the furniture was in their store and that documents and personal items of lesser value had been discarded. When I asked what discarded meant, the woman who answered said it meant they had been placed in the recycling container at the warehouse that was emptied on Fridays. It was Tuesday. The container was emptied in 3 days. I called my attorney Claire, explained the situation in 5 minutes, gave her the name and address of the company, and told her I needed someone to go to that warehouse before Friday to find a cardboard box with documents. Claire told me she would manage it, and the next day she called to tell me they had found the box, that it was intact, and that they had it at her office waiting for instructions. I hung up the phone, and for the first time since waking up I allowed myself to feel something that wasn't the managed version of what I had been feeling, which was managed rage, but something cleaner and clearer than rage. It was the particular calm of someone who has found what they needed and now knows exactly how they are going to proceed. I want to tell you what was in that box because it is the part of the story that requires context to be fully understood. My Aunt Rosa was my mother's youngest sister. She never married, lived alone all her life in a house in the Cully neighbourhood that she had bought in 1987 when Cully was a working-class neighbourhood where prices were accessible for someone on a nurse's salary. The house was small, but the property included a side lot that in 1987 was worth practically nothing, and that with time, as Portland grew and the northeast of the city developed, had been accumulating value in the silent way that well-located properties accumulate value when the world moves around them. Rosa died 10 years ago. She had no children and her only direct family members were Carol and me. She left a handwritten will that divided her possessions between us in equal parts. The main house and its contents were assessed, sold, and the proceeds divided between us formally through the standard probate process. What was not processed formally was the side lot, which in Roser's will appeared separately from the house with a note that said the side lot I leave to my 2 girls in equal parts. May they use it well. The side lot was a plot of approximately 300 square meters that at the time of Roser's death had an assessed value of $42,000. Neither Carol nor I had paid much attention to that detail in the inheritance distribution process because $42,000 divided in 2 was an amount neither of us urgently needed, and because the process of formally registering the property in our names required time and paperwork that at the time we didn't prioritize. The result was that the lot remained technically in Rose's estate without being formally transferred, and that the original title documents, along with the handwritten will and the notes from the probate process, ended up in a box I kept in my closet because my place had more space than Carol's apartment. What neither Carol nor I had paid much attention to in 10 years was what had happened to the lot's value. The Cully neighbourhood over the last 10 years had gone from being a working-class neighbourhood to one of the most sought-after in northeast Portland, with residential development, new businesses, infrastructure improvement, and the consequent property value increases that accompany that type of transformation. The 300 square meter lot that in 2014 was worth $42,000 was worth in 2024, according to the appraisal I requested from the hospital, approximately $480,000. $480,000 divided in 2 was $240,000 each, and the documents establishing that right were in a box at Claire's office waiting for instructions. I spent the recovery weeks in the hospital and then at the home of a friend named Sandra who had a spare room and the generous disposition of someone who understands that real emergencies require space and time and not just good intentions. Carol visited regularly with the attitude of someone fulfilling a responsibility they recognize having created. She brought food, asked how I was, offered to help with paperwork, and I responded with the courtesy of someone who was processing something in silence and knows that the moment for the real conversation hasn't arrived yet. Claire had in the meantime contacted a property law specialist named Marcus. They had reviewed the documents in the box, had confirmed that the original title was valid and that the process of transferring it to our names in equal parts was completely executable given that Roser's will was clear and the original probate process documents were complete. The only missing step was the one that had never been taken, the formal registration of the transfer. Marcus explained that since Carol was co-heir with equal right to mine, the correct process was to notify her and execute the transfer jointly, which meant Carol was going to learn about the lot, which meant I needed to decide how to handle that conversation before it happened another way. I decided to tell her myself, in person, directly, because it was the right way to do it and because I wanted to see her face when she heard it, knowing what I knew about what she had done with the apartment. The conversation was on a Sunday afternoon in Sandra's living room. Carol had come to visit me and I waited until she was sitting with her coffee and then told her I had something to tell her about Aunt Roser's inheritance, specifically about the side lot we had never registered. I explained what it was, explained the current value, explained that the documents had been in the box the second-hand company had discarded and that Claire had recovered 48 hours before they would have been destroyed. Carol processed this information in silence for a moment, and then said, "The box that was in your closet?" I told her yes. There was another silence, longer, during which I could see clearly enough the chain of consequences forming in her mind. The box she had sold without checking, the documents that had almost been destroyed, the value of the lot that had almost been completely lost because of a decision she had made without consulting me while I was unconscious on the floor above. She said, "Good thing they found them," and I said yes, good thing, and let the silence after that sentence do what silences do when they contain more than the words surrounding them have said. I explained the transfer process, told her we needed to act jointly, told her Marcus would guide us through the steps and that the process would take approximately 6 weeks. Carol nodded with the expression of someone participating in a conversation while processing in parallel something that isn't the conversation, and I continued because there was more to say. I told her that in addition to the lot there was something else she needed to hear. I told her that what she had done with my apartment, regardless of intentions, had legally been in an authorized eviction that had caused me real and documentable damages, loss of a below-market lease I wasn't going to be able to replicate, loss of personal belongings whose value could be calculated, and damages resulting from having been left without housing during my recovery. I told her Claire had assessed their situation and that there was basis for a civil lawsuit. I told her I didn't want to reach that point, but that I needed her to understand the real dimension of what had happened, because understanding the dimension was the only path toward a resolution that didn't require a courtroom. Carol was silent for long enough that I knew what I had just said had landed completely. Then she said, "I thought I was helping." And I told her, "I know, and even so the damage is real, and both things can be true at the same time." The lot was transferred to our names in equal parts 6 weeks later. The process was exactly what Marcus had described, without complications. The title was correctly registered and each of us received our 50% of a property that at that time was being courted by 2 developers who had identified the lot as ideal for a small residential project. I sold my share 4 months after the transfer. The offer I accepted was for $250,000 because the market had continued moving during those months and the competition between the 2 developers had driven up the price. Carol sold her share to the same developer for the same price in the same transaction. We both received what Rosa's inheritance owed us with 10 years of delay, and with the additional benefit of a decade of value appreciation that neither of us had anticipated. I settled the civil lawsuit without going to court. Carol and I reached a financial agreement that compensated the value of the goods sold, the differential between the rent I had and the rents available in the current market, and an additional sum that Claire described as recognition of the extraordinary damages of the circumstances. Carol paid without disputing the numbers, which told me she had spoken with her own attorney, and that her attorney had explained with sufficient clarity what a court would have determined. I used that money plus the $250,000 from the property to buy an apartment of my own, the first that is completely mine in the legal sense of the word, in the Alberta neighborhood 3 blocks from where I used to live, with wooden floors and large windows and no landlord because the title is in my name and no one can come to tell me when I have to leave. Mochi lives with me. Jenna returned him the day I moved in with a card that said "Welcome home," and he slept that first night on the edge of the new bed as if there had never been any interruption. Carol and I are still in contact. We are sisters and always will be, and the bond is real even though the relationship has changed shape. What has changed is the architecture of how we relate. There are new boundaries that neither of us names directly but that we both recognize and respect with a tacit understanding of people who have learned something about the costs of not having them. I think Carol learned something that year. I don't know with certainty because Carol is not the type of person who verbalizes difficult lessons. But there is something different in how she consults me now before acting in situations that affect me, something more poised, something that contains the question before the action, which is exactly what I had needed from her and hadn't been able to get in 37 years of asking for it in other ways. I think sometimes about the 48 hours between the Tuesday I woke up and the Thursday the container would have been emptied, about the box of documents sitting in the second-hand company's warehouse not knowing it was the center of a story that hadn't finished happening yet. And I think about Rosa, who died 10 years ago and left that lot with a note saying to use it well. And I think, I used it well, Rosa. I used it exactly well. If anyone ever took something from you while you were at your most vulnerable, while you were too sick or too frightened or too broken to protect yourself, and the person who did it told you they had done it for your own good, I want to tell you something I learned in a hospital bed looking at the ceiling while processing what my sister had done. Good intentions don't cancel real damage. And real damage has legal value regardless of the intentions of whoever caused it. You are allowed to name the damage even if the person who caused it loves you. You are allowed to seek compensation even if that person is your family. You are allowed to protect what is yours even if doing so discomforts people who assumed you weren't going to protect it. And you are allowed to do all of that calmly and without cruelty because calm is not indulgence, it is precision. And precision is what converts an unjust situation into a resolved one. Look for what was lost, even if they tell you it no longer exists, even if they tell you it was too late. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes there are 48 hours and someone willing to go to the warehouse before the container is emptied. And sometimes what you find changes everything that comes after. My name is Isla. I'm 37 years old. And I have an apartment with wooden floors and large windows and a cat on the edge of the bed who sleeps as if there was never any interruption, all completely mine, with the title in my name, in the neighborhood where I want to live. No one can tell me when I have to leave. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself. And if no one has told you lately that good intentions are not enough and that real damage deserves to be named, I'm telling you now.